Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking to Nickolas Means, who is the VP of Engineering at SIM. Nick has been leading software and engineering teams for more than a decade in the HealthTech and DevTools space. We're going to talk a little bit about his experience and kind of focus on how organizations can develop cultures of trust and autonomy while they're building a distributed engineering organization. And I think this is a relevant topic for everybody, regardless if you're in a distributed engineering organization with so much remote work going on these days and the need for collaboration. It's really, really important to develop that culture of autonomy and high trust. But before we do all that, say hi to Nick. Nick, how are you today?
I'm good, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Hey, whereabouts are you located?
I am in Austin.
Austin. That seems to be like the hot place to be these days.
It is, and it's about to be literally the hot place to be. We're coming into the hot months, not far from now.
Well, did you guys get hit by the cold snap that the whole west coast of the U.S. has been?
No, we've missed this one. We did have an ice storm about a month ago that knocked a bunch of power out around here, knocked a bunch of tree limbs down. That was not much fun, but we've missed this one for the most part.
How long have you been in Austin?
I've been here for about 10 years now.
Okay. So I'm in Seattle, and in the early 90s, pretty much all the way through the 90s, Seattle was the hot place to be in terms of, we had all the grunge music and the economy with Microsoft and Starbucks and yada yada was all taken off. And so many people wanted to move here. And it really did change kind of like the local culture. I'm wondering in Austin, are you seeing any of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's it's a big cause for concern, losing the things that make Austin Austin as it becomes too expensive for most of the people that have historically made this town what it is to continue living here.
Yeah, I mean, that's one aspect that Seattle went through, definitely. Seattle primarily was a blue-collar town. The original industries were timber, and then Boeing started, in the 40s, and
Right.
and even most of the Boeing jobs were blue collar. So, but now with Microsoft and Amazon, everything else, it totally changed. So, anyway, hey, let's get onto the topic at hand. Before we start talking about how organizations can develop trust and autonomy in their company cultures, why don't we just take a step back and say, like, why is it important? Because I mean, we're just talking about old school Seattle. Old school management style used to be like, hey, I say do it, and you say, how fast, how high, that kind of thing. Why is autonomy and trust super, super important?
I mean, there's a bunch of reasons, a bunch of different ways I can answer this question. I think the one I'll start with is I'm only so smart. And if I'm the one that's trying to tell everybody on the engineering team what to do and direct everything that they work on, we're going to get ideas that are limited by my ability to think and to be creative. Whereas when you can open up that process to an entire team of people, when you can hand them problems to solve versus solutions to implement, you get much more interesting ideas, and you help the entire team start to build their conception of what the thing you're working on could be. So that, not only are they helping creatively solve the problem that you're bringing to them to ask for them to figure out how to solve, they're coming up with other ideas, and they're injecting their own ideas into the software development process at the same time.
Makes a lot of sense. And I pretty sure for most people that is pretty self-evident. But again, there are some old timers like myself that have worked in traditional organizations where it was very much top down. Not a very fun place to be if you have any kind of initiative or drive. Let me ask you, what are the challenges? I mean, if it's so self-evident, what are the challenges to develop trust and autonomy?
I mean, I think, one of the biggest ones is management and leadership ego. It's really hard to turn over that amount of control. And to shift your conception of your role from one of being more directive to being in more of a supportive role, while also making sure that the things that need to get done. It's a much harder way to conceive of the job of manager or leader than the traditional, like you're talking about, the traditional top-down management role where you're just kind of calling the shots and telling people what to do.
Yeah,
So I think
I've definitely seen that, and even with myself in certain situations, sometimes it's hard when you have a challenge and you just want to tell people just get it done, take care of it, do it
yeah.
this way, and then that's probably, well, it's not the most effective way for a couple of reasons. It's not very motivational, but like you said, it's impossible to be smarter than everybody else, so it's better to have that kind of network effect. When you talk about this challenge, though, where does the change start with? Does it start with the leader who has to kind of let go of the ego, or does it is it a bottom up type thing, or how do you start to affect that kind of the cultural development?
That's a really great question, Mark. I mean, I think, part of it is there are certainly engineers out there that would prefer to work in an environment where they have a relatively defined backlog. They're plucking things off that backlog. They're writing them, and then they're done with that task and on to the next one. It's not to say that that's not a valid way to work. It absolutely is, and there are certain things in the engineering world that might even work a little bit better that way. So part of it is to even get started going down this path of higher agency, higher autonomy. You sort of have to figure out if you have folks on your team that want to work this way in the first place. Because if you've hired a team entirely predicated on more of a command and control approach, this is going to be a pretty tough shift. Not to say that you can't do it, but it's tougher to turn that corner. That's like, if you have a manager that's brought in to kind of implement this style of process, to implement more of a high autonomy, high psychological safety culture, that's that approach to the problem. Or you're having to teach a team how to do it. The flip side is you might be an engineer on a team that does have a more command and control leadership style. And you can definitely do some things bottom up to encourage your manager to let go a little bit and to give more trust to the team. A lot of it's just delivering above and beyond and showing them, letting them see over time that you've got the competency to start making some of those decisions.
Some really good points, and I've been in both situations. I try to give people a lot of autonomy. In fact, I'll just say, hey, we've identified this challenge or problem. Can you give it some thought and maybe come back with some ideas? And that works really well with some people, but I've also had the experience where people are like, wow, you just dumped all of this on me and I just want you to tell me what to do. So,
Yeah.
and it's so how do you, if your goal is to build this uh, culture of trust and autonomy, how do you manage the hiring process so that you're bringing or onboarding people who share the same kind of idea?
Yeah. There's things that you can look for in the hiring process. I think the tech hiring process in general, the way we hire engineers, it tends to be a little too heavily weighted towards technical screening. We tend to look really hard if somebody's technically capable of doing the job, and our evaluation kind of stops there. Whereas, really, what you're looking for is somebody that can come in and be a part of a team and be effective working alongside other people and ship good work. And to do that, you sort of have to get them to tell you stories about teams they've been part of in the past. You have to ask more, tell me a time in your career where you saw something that wasn't getting done and you stepped in to do it. So you're looking for, do you know how to take initiative? Do you know how to work with others to get work done? And it's very much, it's a harder thing to suss out in an interview, and it's a much more imprecise process.
But we could probably have multiple podcasts just on the art of hiring. I mean, seriously, I think it's probably the most important thing that any leader does is just hiring, getting the right people on the bus, as I think it's Jim
Yeah.
Collins used to say. Yeah. In order to get the right people on the bus and keep them on the bus, you have to do a good job of hiring and then giving them, creating the environment that kind of nurtures them or brings them along. You mentioned some of the specifics towards, hiring engineers. What is there anything specific related to, IT engineering, software development, the people who do those jobs? Is there anything specific or particular in relation to developing autonomy or trust with them that's different from non-technical?
It's a great question. I think, one thing that I'll say about that, there's some things in Andy Grove's book that I would take or leave. But one of them that stuck with me is the idea of task relevant maturity. So if you want a team to grow in this level of autonomy, and you want them to grow in their ability to do this kind of work, you have to make sure that you're asking them to do things that they're ready to step into. If you take a junior engineer and you ask them to step into architecting a new major API component, that may be too much for them to bite off. And stepping into something that intimidating can actually be detrimental to somebody's leadership development, because they might learn to not trust themselves. Um, I think the other thing that I would say in response to that is, obviously, um, you need to have some level of ability to have those discussions as a leader. You don't necessarily need to be in the code every day necessarily, I don't think. I know some leaders that are and prefer to lead that way. But you at least need to be able to ask the right questions and conversations to show the team that you have the technical capability to sort of be in the room, yes, to put it that way.
And So I've spent most of my career on the sales side, on business development side, and I have something called like a verbal toolbox, which basically any situation that I'm in front of a client, I have some like go-to phrases, and it's nice to have them
Yeah.
as long as they don't come off as sounding, too contrived, right? But when somebody asks you something and you can't answer, you say, hey, you know what? That's a really good question. I haven't heard that before. Let me go and check with my team, and I'll get back to you, by X time with an answer. So whatever it is, I mean, you can have this thing, and when you have that. It helps you. It helps you with confidence, but you always have something to go to fall back on.
Yeah.
What are some of the go-to phrases or questions that, as a leader, you could ask just to check in with somebody to see how comfortable they are with this proposed task?
I want to rewind to something that you just said that I think is really important, because one of the most important things you can do as a leader is to model saying, I don't know. Because you walk in the room with more power than anybody else in the room, generally speaking, in terms of a normal organization with normal power dynamics. And if you as the leader can say, I don't know, I need to go find out, and I'll get back to you with an answer, it makes it much easier for the folks on your team to be able to say that as well. So I think that's a really important point, and I didn't want us to whisk past that. And then to speak to the actual question you asked around what are some questions that you can ask to understand where they are and understanding the task that's before them. I think it even starts a little further than that, along with the I don't know thing. It's a matter of building an environment of psychological safety on the team, where everybody in the team feels comfortable raising that sort of information to you in the first place, where it feels like something, I'm not sure how to do this. This feels a little bit big, a little bit unapproachable. Is a safe thing to say to you as the manager of the team, because it's really easy for someone to the power dynamics of the situation to make somebody want to please you to the point that they're not bringing information like that. They just want to make you happy and do what you're asking them to do, and so they hide the fact that they don't quite get it. And I think we've all seen projects kind of go off the rails because of that. That's how I learned some of these lessons in the first place.
Now, massively important skill to be able to do that. Let's flip the table a bit and say, sometimes you could have almost too much communication about an objective as opposed to just getting it done.
Mhm.
And I've been in cultures where it just seems like there's so much time spent on, idea sharing, ideation, as you could call it, and collaboration and building consensus, that things that should have been done yesterday aren't getting done for, literally months. So how do you balance it?
I mean, I think a lot of that it comes down to making sure everybody understands the business need in front of them. Like, why are they doing the work in the first place? I always look for. I always feel like it's a bit of a failure on my part to appropriately establish the vision for what we're trying to do if I'm also having to push for the urgency to get it done. If I'm having to artificially introduce urgency to get the team to move quickly enough. Because by and large, when you paint the picture in a vivid enough way and everybody in the team understands what you're trying to do, when you need to do it, why you need to do it by then, I've seen teams generally drive their own urgency in that situation.
That's awesome. What can you tell about the importance of learning from failures? Because you try enough things, sooner or later you will fail at something. And how do you react to that, and how can you turn that into kind of a learning situation?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it, as the leader, you carry a lot of the key to it, because the way that you react is the way that the rest of your team will react to failure when it happens. And I talk a lot with teams that I lead about being blameless in those situations. If somebody dropped a table out of the production database, I don't really care who did it. I care why it made sense and what we can do to the system to make it safer so that that doesn't make sense in the future, or that they don't accidentally do what happened in the future. So I think a lot of it is when something doesn't go the way that you expect it to, you look to find the systemic cause or the missing context, or what you could have done from a systemic company level to get to a different outcome, versus the temptation that's always there to just blame it on the individual and move on. That's the key thing that you have to avoid. Is Sidney Decker talks a lot about the idea that there's no such thing as human error. That every decision that a human makes sense in the environment that they make it, because people generally don't come to work to do a bad job. They want to do good work.
That
Um,
that I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it's funny when you put it that way. That's awesome.
yeah, and so I mean, if you start with that as a baseline assumption that nobody showed up today to drop a table out of the production database, okay, well, why did that happen? Um, that leads you down a whole different path of thinking than, well, they just weren't being careful enough.
Hmm. I mean, you could argue that at some level there's just incompetence, and that you you may need to do something more than just making sure that it doesn't happen again. Maybe you have to talk to that person or that team, and I mean, that's a real situation that we all face from time to time as well.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, in that case, though, I think you kind of have to look in the mirror and ask how that person got to be in the role that they're in the first place.
Damn, man, you're not letting anybody off the hook here. Uh,
I've had to look in that mirror before.
It's uncomfortable. And a couple things there. One of the best leaders that I ever worked for, I made a pretty sizable mistake early on in my career, cost the company some money, and I thought I'm doomed. But I went and I told him, and he said, "Well, what'd you learn?" And I had to tell him what I learned, and he goes, "Is that gonna happen again?" And I said, "Nope." And he goes, "All right, get back to work." And I was like the coolest thing ever. And I realized that if he didn't develop that kind of sense of trust that I could go to him and share a mistake that I made, that I'd probably start hiding those kind of
Yep.
mistakes, and then that could hurt the company in the longer term.
Yep, absolutely. That's one of the key tenets to the idea of like blameless retrospectives after an incident is when an incident happens, you want the first person to see it, to raise it, even if it was their mistake that caused it, because you want everybody to be able to contribute to solving it. It's a common pattern that somebody makes a mistake, and then in trying to fix the mistake, they make the mistake about 100 times worse. Whereas if they had just caught their breath, brought other people on the team in, it would have been a pretty minor hiccup in the grand scheme of things.
If you remember Nick Gleason, he was the guy who brought down Barings Bank, which at that time was like one of the world's oldest banks. It was I think early 2000s. He was in Singapore,
Mhm.
and he was trading derivatives, and he did a couple trades that went sideways. Instead of reporting them, he doubled down and then doubled down and doubled down. And at one point, I mean, he knew that the whole thing was going to collapse, and he basically hopped a plane to Malaysia and was hiding out in the jungle, and they came and got him.
Yeah.
and but it's kind of scary because it's like, well, I can fix this, and it just in his case never got fixed. And another thing that you brought up is in terms of managers having to kind of look themselves in the mirror and admit, when they make mistakes. And I've another leader that I worked with, one of the things that he would say was that, everybody at first blames themselves, but then it doesn't feel comfortable. So immediately what we start to do is look for blaming the competition, blaming the market, blaming the people we work with, and blaming the people around us. And that's just kind of I guess human nature. What do you do to kind of level set with yourself, or what would you recommend that people do to kind of say, hey, you know what, blaming doesn't really help. Again, let's not focus on who, but on why this happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I have found myself doing is teaching a team to avoid blame, but being very comfortable with blaming myself. And I
Hmm.
don't think that's a healthy pattern either. You want to acknowledge the places where you may have some shortcomings, or you may have not delivered the information that you needed, but ultimately, every time, if you really look at it, there is a systemic cause. There's always a systemic cause that you can find. Maybe you didn't spend enough time developing the interview process. You rushed it out because you needed to get somebody on board in a hurry. And because you developed that process in a hurry, you missed a whole kind of vein of questions that you should be asking to vet if somebody was an appropriate fit for your organization. So it's a matter of chasing that bunny trail far enough back that you get to systemic information that lets you make a change. Because again, I mean, leaders don't come to work intending to do a bad job either.
No, I totally agree with you. But what are some of the expressions or phrases that you could use to kind of, make people understand that we're not out to blame anybody? What do you say?
So things you can say to help shift the conversation away from blame. So one of the things that that's in my toolbox that I use on a regular basis, that we actually read at the top of every incident retrospective that we do, is the retrospective prime directive. And it says that regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. And I found that just by reading that at the start of a discussion about an incident just kind of gets everybody lined up in the same direction, gets people thinking of giving each other the benefit of the doubt, and really looking beyond individuals towards finding systemic things that we could have done differently. I also use the word learning a lot. I talk about, we're looking to see everything that we can learn from this incident, everything that we can learn from what happened, so that we can make changes that will keep it from happening again. So it's just that constant reinforcement that the thing that we're looking for here is learning. We're not looking to blame anybody. We're not looking to figure out whose fault this is. We just want to learn from it because it already happened. We can't go back in the past and change it. So the only thing that's left here is to figure out how to keep it from happening again.
That's awesome, man. And I think your point about learning is probably one of the key, if not the key elements of success for almost any organization out there. I mean, it's the whole idea of getting an MVP or a minimum viable product out to market. It's because then you have an opportunity to learn. You get that feedback immediately, right? And if you're just working in a silo, you could be going totally in the wrong direction. But you need feedback, and if you're making mistakes, make them soon so that you can learn from them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to where we started this call, the whole idea of why you don't want to be a top-down leader and why you don't want that sort of leadership structure on your team. You want everybody oriented around learning. You want as many eyes on the problem as you can get, because that makes it a whole lot more likely that you're going to find a viable solution in the end.
Totally agree. So let's talk about another kind of learning that sometimes feels a little forced, but it's kind of one of those necessary evils, and that's working alongside with compliance. And oftentimes the compliance, they will have us go through different programs in terms of how we do our work, but also we have to learn about different industry standards or internal policies and so on and so forth. How do you kind of balance what compliance needs to do with what the business needs to do, and make sure that both sides are kind of working together in the same direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it all kind of goes back to the same thing. The way that you get a team moving in the right direction is to make sure that they have the context around what the business is doing at that time. Part of the context you need to give the team is why compliance is important, why we have to pay attention to these things, what happens if we don't, how paying attention to these things sets us up for success in the long run. At the same time, the onus is kind of on you as a leader to work with the compliance people in your organization, to help them understand the same thing, to help them understand your business objectives, to help them understand what the team is focused on right now, what things feel urgent, and help them sort of time compliance initiatives and bring them up to the team in a way that doesn't feel threatening, that feels collaborative. Because ultimately that's what you're looking to set up, right? Is that collaborative relationship between engineering and compliance, so that engineering doesn't feel like compliance is some outside presence that's coming in to completely ruin the way that they work. And so that compliance doesn't feel like engineering is pushing back on literally everything they ask for.
How important is it for the compliance team to understand how the engineering team works?
I think it's absolutely critical.
Okay.
Because it's really easy for compliance to come in and completely disrupt the way of an engineering team, the way that they do their work. Likewise, there's ways that compliance can come alongside the engineering team, help them find a way to put the controls in place that they need to put in place without disrupting the way that they work. You mentioned I lead engineering at SIM, and that's actually the whole thing that we're about as a company, is helping put access controls in place for organizations in a way that's not disruptive, that's not compliance coming in and going, okay, every time you want to deploy code, you need to get these 6 sign-offs. It's okay, how can we come in and add this control that's required for these reasons, but do it in a light touch way so that it doesn't slow down our velocity, so that it doesn't feel like it's a big drag on our ability to get work across the line.
That's almost kind of a use case right there. Could you expand on that idea of how you can go in and kind of make that process easier?
Yeah, a lot of it is when compliance comes in and is looking to put a control in place, actually work with the engineering team to sort of figure out the right way to put that control in place, to bring the control to the team and collaborate with them to identify the right way to do it. Another example, one of the ways that we use SIM at SIM, we're a small company. We don't have a whole lot of controls in place because we're pretty early stage. A lot of companies at our stage would probably still have wide open admin access for a lot of people on the team. We don't have that. We have controls in place for that, and the way that we manage that is by peer approval for production system access. So it's sort of a 2 keys to launch the rocket approach. If somebody needs to get into production to do something, they use SIM to request that access, to post the reason for that access, and then anybody else on the engineering team can click the approve button if that access makes sense. And so usually if you need to get into production to check a log or to do something, in about 30 seconds, you've got approval to do that. And then our systems kicked in on the back end to change your AWS role to give you access to whatever it is that you requested access to. So it's a matter of, we didn't want everybody carrying wide open admin access to our production systems for obvious reasons. And we didn't want to make the compromise that a lot of startups do to carry on that way long term, just to speed stuff up to help us deliver software faster. But we also couldn't afford to compromise significantly on our ability to deliver software and to slow down. So we defaulted to peer approval as a way to do that, and used our own tool set to do it.
That's a great example. And I'm just curious, can you, when you grant that approval, can you do it for a certain duration or a certain task?
So when you request the approval, when you request the access in the first place, you attach a duration to that request. Mm-hmm. And then when that duration expires, it automatically gets unwound on the AWS side. So we make sure the system automatically comes back and cleans up your access after you're done.
Awesome. So let me ask you, I mean, because you have your own podcast called Managing Up. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, why did you create or co-host it, and what's it about?
Yeah, so we like to jokingly refer to it as a peer mentoring session that we record and put on the internet. We end up talking about a bunch of different things, kind of like what we've been talking about here around, the ideas of blameless culture and how do you motivate a team. Every week we'll pick sort of a management topic, some of them from listener questions, some of them just based on what we're dealing with in our respective jobs at the time, and spend 45 minutes or an hour talking about it. But it is very much sort of a free-flowing conversation between the three of us, and occasionally a guest that we'll invite on.
And then once you agree on a topic, do you go away and do a little research on it, or is it just you're kind of sharing your ideas about it?
It just depends. There are times that we have all three read a book together before we recorded an episode on a topic, and there's other times that we've shown up the day of recording and figured out what we wanted to talk about and just dove straight in. We kind of know we're hitting on a rich vein of conversation when we have to cut the conversation off so that we don't waste too much material before we hit the record button.
Hey, let's talk about your role. I mean, you're VP of engineering. So I'm assuming that you work very, very closely with the product team. Tell me how that conversation unfolds, because if you have a head of product, that's an assumption. I should clear up first. I mean, do you have a head of product?
We do, yeah.
Okay. So, obviously that relationship would be really, really important. Are there times when, you go to the product team and say, maybe we've got our priorities a little bit out of order. Maybe we should reprioritize in a different way, knowing though that you're not head of product. I mean, do you have any challenges like that from time to time?
I mean, I think one of the things that you have to have for a successful engineering and product leadership relationship is a healthy sense of tension there. Product should be pulling for features and for users and for developing the things that users need. Engineering should be pushing back when necessary to make sure there's bandwidth for things like refactoring and for technical debt payback and that sort of thing. But I think it's important that happens between the product leader and the engineering leader and not in front of the team. The team should always feel like they're essentially being co-led by head of product, head of engineering. There should always be apparent harmony to the engineering organization from those two roles. And I think that's really important because, I think we've all seen product and engineering relationships that have kind of devolved to the point where it's really contentious and, product is pushing for criteria for done, and engineering is just trying to check all of those check boxes, and it's not a productive relationship at that point. So I think a lot of making that relationship successful happens in the relationship that product and engineering leaders build one-on-one.
That's I think some great advice there. The challenge that I see with product teams is that they're getting pulled in many directions as well, right? I mean, you've got their research, you've got what customers are asking for, you've got what your sales teams are asking for. And it's kind of like, okay, what's real? What do we really need and how do we prioritize that?
Yeah.
And in the cybersecurity space, it's actually kind of interesting because a lot of companies, depending on their solution or the type of solution they're offering, but if they're any kind of like intrusion detection or malware or business email compromise type of product, instead of looking at the competition, for example, which a lot of companies in many other industries will do, they'll say, hey, what's the competition doing, and what are our customers asking for? But in the spaces that I was just referencing, they're actually looking at what the bad actors are doing, right? And saying,
Mm.
okay, what's the latest evolution of these threats that our customers might not even be aware of, that our competitors probably or might not be aware of, or at least haven't developed a function or feature to address yet. So, and so that's kind of an interesting thing. In terms of what SIM does, where does the motivation for, the next set of features and functions come from?
A lot of it comes from our existing customers. SIM is a very flexible product. It's configured via Terraform, so you can write workflows that do pretty much whatever you need them to do. And so we're kind of looking for people to cow path features for us. Once we start to see that cow path wearing in the grass, where people are doing sort of the same thing over and over again with SIM, then we start going, okay, well, maybe we should pay a little bit more attention to this and make it into a first-class integration or a first-class feature of the platform, make it easier to do the thing that it seems like customers are doing over and over again. And then the other area, of course, is, what are we hearing on sales calls? What features are people asking for that would make it easy for them to buy SIM if the product just did that? So then you have to do the hard part of taking all of those disparate inputs and figure out, okay, well, what do we do next with the limited time that we have?
That's a great observation and a great method. Obviously, you've given a lot of thought to leadership styles and team building and so on. If you had to name like one or two books or resources that you'd say, hey, you know what, anybody in a leadership position should go and get a hold of this, what would they be?
My go-to recommendation is Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet. And I love it. I tend to love things that are sort of outside the normal sphere of technology and technology leadership. And that's definitely an example of it. David Marquet was a nuclear submarine captain, and he very much implemented a leadership model that sort of bucked the traditional military hierarchy and turned an underperforming nuclear sub into the top performing boat in the fleet. And it's very much it doesn't read like a typical management book where it's like, here's an aphorism. It's actual stories from his time leading this submarine and the people, the way that they developed through that process, the way the boat developed through that process, and the way that he interacted with his leadership and built trust with his leadership to try this in the first place. So as far as a toolkit of how do you go about building a more high autonomy approach to leadership and team, that's my go-to resource there.
Awesome. Greatly appreciated. It's on my list, and I'll be ordering it on Amazon later today. So let me ask you, what do you got planned for 2023 for SIM? Any events, any new developments that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think, in the year to come for us, we're looking at expanding the platform. Right now, we primarily support AWS workflows as far as infrastructure, support Okta, OneLogin, a few other things as well. We're very seriously evaluating GCP support, so expanding the platform out where it can manage access and escalation on the GCP platform. And then, also looking at what are the other systems that our customers are using SIM to manage. One of the powers of the platform is you can use an AWS Lambda to sort of do anything you need the platform to do that it doesn't already cover. So what are the things that they're using those Lambdas to address?
Do you guys go to any industry events, or if people want to get more information from you, what's the best way to do that?
We're definitely going to be at SRECon, and I will be speaking at Lead Developer London this summer in June as well. But the best way to get information from us is via our website at simops.com, symops.com. We actually just posted a brand new demo video on the front page of the site. So if you want to hear more of my voice, that's one place you can go to hear it.
Awesome. So thank you so much for that. Hey, Nick, I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. It was a lot of fun.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.